To look at creating a new virtual machine, I'm going to use my host machine, which is this test dev computer, and that has the two virtual machines we've been using all during class. The first thing I'm going to do is actually put my two virtual machines here in a save state. So I'm going to right click RTS Serve 1 and I'm going to go to save. And I'm going to do the same for RTS DC1. When I save, everything that's running, that's resident in memory, if you have documents open, applications open, all that gets saved, then the virtual machine actually gets powered off. So it stops consuming resources. When I go back to this virtual machine and start it, it'll reload to that exact point. So whatever windows were open, those same windows will be open once I start this and log back into it. Now to create the new virtual machine, I'm just going to go to Actions and New Virtual Machine. And this, before you begin, I'm just going to click Next. And the name of this virtual machine, I'm going to name it RTS-SVR2. Store the virtual machine in a different location. This is the option we just looked at when we were installing Hyper-V, and it asked us if we wanted to change the default location. This was that location. So we could have changed the default if I wanted it to be stored somewhere different, or anytime you create a virtual machine, you could choose a different location. But I'm not going to change the location. We're going to leave it where it is in that default location. So I'll click Next for that. Now it wants us to specify the generation. The Generation 1 are really for older legacy operating systems, but they do support 32-bit and 64-bit virtual machines. They support a boot volume of up to 2 terabytes, and it also has this legacy BIOS. Does not support some of the advanced features like secure boot that most modern computers would actually support. And you can also run any operating system in Generation 1. If you wanted a Windows 7 virtual machine or a 2008 virtual machine, any of those old operating systems you could run. Generation 2 virtual machines require you to run Windows Server 2012 or Windows 8. Has to be a 64-bit operating system. And instead of using a traditional BIOS, it uses this UEFI, which is Unified Enhanced Firmware Interface. Everyone calls it UFI. That is firmware instead of a traditional BIOS. The advantage of that is that it supports secure boot, which is a way to help protect like your boot files, like the low-level OS files, where Generation 1 machines do not give you that capability. And it also supports a boot volume of up to 64 terabytes, where the Gen 1 was a max of 2 terabytes. There is no downside to a Generation 2 virtual machine. So unless you are installing an operating system older than Server 2012 or Windows 8, or it's a 32-bit operating system. If neither of those things are true, then you would always choose a Generation 2. But be aware, once you choose your generation, you cannot change it. You'd have to actually create a new virtual machine. So no way to modify it. But I'm going to create a Generation 2 because that's the standard now. When I assign memory, I can decide how much memory should be assigned. This startup memory is how much memory will be consumed when the virtual machine powers on. Now I'm going to enter 2048 megabytes. So that's 2 gigs of RAM. 2 gigs of RAM is enough for our server to run, and be usable. 4096 megabytes or 4 gigs of RAM, it will run very well. But it depends on how many resources you have in your actual host as to what you choose. Now, this is just the startup memory. So that is the maximum amount of RAM that will be used on startup. Then I can enable dynamic memory. Dynamic memory will let this virtual machine just scale up and down based on its memory demands. So if it needs more memory, it'll consume more memory. If it no longer needs that additional memory, it'll automatically be released. If you do not enable this dynamic memory, it's going to use this number all the time. So in my case, this VM would always use 2 gigs of RAM if I don't enable dynamic memory. Now, one of the advantages of virtualization is the dynamic memory because it allows you to kind of over allocate memory utilization. Assuming not every virtual machine is going to need maximum memory at the same time, It just kind of scales up and down between different VMs on the same host so you get the most efficient use of your resources. But I do want that checked, the dynamic memory, and both of these are easily reconfigurable after the fact. But we'll choose next for that. For the networking, if I already have a virtual switch, I could connect this machine to a virtual switch. Right now, we are going to leave this on not connected. Not connected is the same as you installing Server 2019 on a computer in your home or in your office, and you don't have the network cable plugged in. You're just installing from media. That is the way this will be, not connected. Then when I want this to access network resources, internet resources, when we want that to happen, we will then create a virtual switch, and we will come back here and connect that virtual machine to the virtual switch. That would be the same as plugging the network cable in your computer or connecting to a wireless network. You would now have access to the network, to the internet, but we're going to say on not connected right now. Now for the virtual hard disk, it has to be a VHDX file. Cannot be an older VHD. It is always in a VHDX format. This is the location we saw when we installed Hyper-V. The default location for the virtual hard drive is through that C users public documents. If you wanted this stored somewhere else, you could change that. The default location determined nothing but what was pre-populated here for us. Now this always defaults to be 127 gigs. That is not that significant because it's a dynamically expanding disk. So it is only as large as what you put in it. It starts off at just a couple of megs in size, but once you install the operating system and you create data, it just starts to grow and grow. It will not exceed 127 gigs unless we extend it, which we can easily do after the fact. Now, a VHDX file has a max size of 64 terabytes. So could be that large, assuming you have the capacity for it. You could also say you want to use an existing virtual hard disk. Hyper-V is compatible between your Windows client, like Windows 10, and Server 2019. So if you install Hyper-V on Windows 10, you can create a virtual machine. You can then take the virtual hard drive for that machine and have it copied over or make it accessible to your server. And you could simply say, I want to use an existing virtual hard drive. And this virtual machine I'm configuring now will link itself to that hard drive, and you would now be able to run that virtual machine on your server. And the opposite's also true. I could copy a virtual hard drive like RTS DC1 here. I could copy this to a Windows 10 machine and create a virtual machine that uses that hard disk, and it would now run on my Windows 10 client. So it's really portable, basically. Or you could say, I just want to attach a virtual hard disk later. Now you have to attach a disk before you can install the operating system. We are choosing option 1, create a new virtual hard disk. So we'll choose next for that. Now it says, what do you want to do about an operating system? You could install an operating system later. This third option, install an operating system from a network-based installation server. That is grayed out because my network adapter is not connected. And it even says that. Your network adapter is disconnected. If I had already created a virtual switch, then this would be an option we could click on. Now, this assumes you have some server on the network. Microsoft has a Windows deployment server. They have another server called Configuration Manager, a tool called MDT, or the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and there are an infinite number of third-party products that can deploy operating systems. So if you were trying to install that way, that would be the option for you. But I want to install from an ISO file. So I'm going to just choose install an operating system from a boot image file, and I'm going to browse, and that's my boot image file. Now, if I click open, that would just automatically be attached. An interesting thing, if you choose to install an operating system later, it creates a little more work for you actually. So I'm going to go to next and finish, and my virtual machine is created. That's RTS Serve 2. Now let's say you now want to attach an ISO file so you can boot this virtual machine. Well, to do that, I'm going to just right click and go to settings. There is no CD drive that shows up here. So The way Hyper-V works now, if you attach an ISO file, it automatically adds a SCSI controller and a CD-ROM to your virtual machine. If you do not do that, it assumed you may not even want a CD-ROM on the virtual machine, so it does not add one. So now what I have to do is select Add Hardware, SCSI Controller, Add, DVD drive is in this list, and I'm going to click Add. And you'll see now it says DVD drive. This will let me browse for the image file. Now I could choose the ISO, which I already have here. Just the ISO for Server 2019 that was downloaded from the Microsoft site. Now I could boot this and begin installing the operating system.